Dr. Garg, thank you very much for that introduction. Thank you very much for your invitation to talk to you today. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Being a finance section, you would perhaps expect a session of big numbers, and we've had a lot of big numbers today, but I promise you we're only going to talk about a few big numbers, and I'll warn you when you're coming. But just to give you a sense of the size of what we're talking about, I think there are about 3 or 4 numbers which I want you to concentrate on. I represent the European Investment Bank, which is Europe's JICA, or the World Bank, or the Asian Development Bank. We're there for government-to-government cooperation between the European Union and the government of India. And the field that we're chosen to focus our cooperation on is on climate change. So this is, hence my presence here today. And a good example of that cooperation is in the offshore wind sector. Now, the European Union has been working for the past 6 years with MNRE here in Delhi and with NIVE down in Chennai to help develop the pre-feasibility and feasibility studies towards what looks to be at least a 5 gigawatt set of farms by 2025 is the ambition, and a 30 gigawatt ambition by 2030. Now, just to give you an idea of how important and how significant that ambition is, worldwide at the moment, there is only 20 gigawatt installed. And 19 of that 20 are installed in Northern Europe. And already, India, with its first project, which is probably going to be launched in the next month or 2 by MNRE, with a 1 gigawatt wind farm off the coast of Gujarat, is going to be a world-class, market-leading wind farm, and will probably be the biggest single wind farm in the world at this year, and will be certainly by far the first and biggest in the region. So these are important points of engagement on renewable energy. I think a second factor that we've got to think about is, following the recent elections, the Prime Minister called for a $5 trillion economy. So he's proposing to double India's economy. Now, of course, the impacts on that are quite deep and quite widespread. It will, of course, mean more energy. But as the economy grows, it will become more energy intensive. So you think about the conversion of transport into electrification of transport, much more manufacturing, and as a prosperous India will want more cooling, and of course there's the ever-present issue of water. And desalination of water is a massively energy-intensive thing. So I think MNRE's announcement just in the past couple of days that it's going to more than triple the energy generation capacity of India between now and 2030 to 1 terawatt. So it's going from 350 gigawatts at the moment to 1 terawatt by 2030. And of that, 400 megawatts will be renewable energy. So our world, the world in which we're talking about renewable energy, is changing very dramatically. And the investment needs to drive that 400 gigawatt of generation is not just in the billions or even the tens of billions of dollars, it's in the hundreds of billions of dollars annually. And you look at the Indian financial sector, to answer partly your question, Dr. Garg. The Indian financial sector is improving, but it's struggling. It's struggling with non-performing loans, it's struggling with the bankruptcy code, which is trying to deal with it, and it's struggling with the non-bank financial center. So where is this extra capital going to come from? Well, I want to talk to you briefly about a new source of capital called sustainable finance. Now, that's perhaps a bit of a tautology in that, as you were saying, converting current into capital, into currency, is important. That's finance by its very nature is sustainable. But there is a whole language that's developing now around sustainable finance. Now, the one takeaway I would like you to think about today is that even though there are huge demands on capital, There is plenty of capital around, but the key to it, to getting that capital, is capital will always chase the best projects. So people with the most money find it easier to get more money. So, and that's the whole point. So the point about this afternoon is designing the best possible projects, the best possible renewable energy capital. So there are two pools of capital that I think we should be focusing on. One is internationally. There are a set of mandated renewable energy funds by green fund managers and sustainable fund managers. And the sovereign wealth funds, I don't know if you've been watching the news, they're all pulling out of, slowly, but they're all pulling out of fossil fuel investments. So there's a set of mandated international funds that are looking for projects and good returns on projects. And you may have noticed that interest rates internationally are incredibly low at the moment. So now is a good time to be borrowing and setting up these. So these fund managers are hungry for returns that the kind of rupee rates can give them, which they may not be able to get in dollar terms, but rupee terms that they can. So they're hungry for the business that they can get in India. Interestingly, there's a second set of pool of funds which is largely untapped domestically. There are going to be a large number of changes in the insurance industry announced under the recent budget. So there's a new set of pools of funds coming from insurance. And I understand there is an untapped saver base in India that is measured in the trillions. So $3 trillion of untapped savings available for investments. Where are all this money going to go? They're going to go into the very best projects. And the sustainable finance projects, there are really three broad terms of these funds that are looking to invest. There's the green bonds that you will have heard a lot about, and the green bond market is around $1 trillion at the moment. There are SDG or sustainable finance bonds, and that's about 150 billion a year. And then there's the so-called ESG funds, the environmental, sustainable and governance funds. So what is this sustainable finance? Well, sustainable finance is anything that promotes the implementation of the SDGs. And there are three primary SDGs that we're looking at. You probably know that there are 17 SDGs, but there are three that are particularly important. SDG 7 is about affordable clean energy. SDG 13 is about climate action. And SDG 11 is about sustainable cities and communities. Now, there are people who want to invest in these projects. And they, not only that, they want to and they have to because they're mandated to. But beyond that, there are an additional set of factors, SDGs, that they're interested in. So a secondary set of things. By improving the energy situation, people can address SDG 6 and use that to provide clean water and sanitation. They can address SDG 3 and improve the health of people, and SDG 8 by providing good work and economic growth for the country. So these are all issues that are fundamentally important to the government of India, where there are people who are mandated to provide finance. So how do we change the projects that we're doing to make sure that they can implement the projects and attract the best capital? Well, the EIB was the first and is still the largest issuer of green bonds worldwide. And back in March 2017, the G20 invited the EIB to come up for proposals for crowding in private capital for climate action and the SDGs. So they took and developed with the International Capital Markets Association based in Basel in Switzerland. They developed a set of green bond principles which have now evolved into the sustainable bond principles. And there are 5 principles which I'll just very briefly talk to you about. The first is the use of the proceeds. The first principle, so there are a defined set of topics where people can invest their money in. Those topics are defined in a taxonomy so that you can't just say that everything that you're doing is green. You can't just greenwash it. You have to use a formal taxonomy. So the use of proceeds is probably the primary criteria. In your bond documentation and in your loan documentation, the second principle is that you have to define your process for selecting, designing, and implementing the projects. So the financiers and the investors have to take responsibility for some of the outcomes, and particularly the SDG outcomes that are coming on. The third principle is the ring fencing of the proceeds, so that you can't just tell the world that you're raising money for green projects and then use the money for something else. So the money has to be ring fenced, and that includes unused proceeds. So while you've raised the money, you might have some time before you can disperse it. So that ring fencing is the third point. The fourth point is about transparency. It's about reporting annually on what you've done with that money. And that's now an increasingly important obligation for issuers of green bonds and sustainable bonds. They have to report in the same way as they report their financial statements at the end of the year. They have to provide annual reporting on their green and sustainable bonds. And the final principle is independent verification. So in the same way that your financial statements are audited at the end of the year, you have to have independent verification of the SDG and green outcomes of your projects. So those 5 principles have to be adhered to when you're raising money in the international markets or even the domestic markets for capital in renewable energy projects. But that on alone is not what's going to make the difference. So you have to go, in order to attract the private capital will go to the best projects in the best markets. So there has to be some, and this is my final point, there has to be some focus on developing India's capital markets, which at the moment are a bit thin and a bit underrated. There's a reasonable primary market, so people can issue bonds reasonably, but there's almost no secondary market, so no trading of those bonds, except in very rare cases. So the important part is to develop capital markets which have a strong primary market and an even stronger secondary market. And how do you do that? Well, there are three or four basic points. As in all things and all money, it depends on quality issuers, the top quality issuers, and quality bonds, so that have some kind of credit enhancement. Secondly, you need benchmark scale. So some people, when they talk about green bonds, they're going out to talk to small corporates or to tier 2 municipalities. I think in order to develop in the Indian capital markets, you need to focus completely at the other end. You need the biggest companies out there issuing across the full yield curve. So from 3 years out to 15 years out to 20 years. And they need to be benchmark issues of a sufficient size so that when people are coming into the market to buy and sell, they're not shifting the market. The third point is really, in order to achieve that benchmark scale, you need some big demand aggregators. So people, issuers, and this is typically the financial sector players. So the demand aggregators are going out looking for individual projects, solar farms, wind energy farms, biomass, whatever it turns out to be. They're demanding the aggregate for the finance at the issuer level. And the important point about that step is that there's no, when that's happened, when you're issuing at that scale and at that size, then there's no yield premium. So the borrowers, so the renewable energy projects, are not having to pay extra because their projects are green or more risky. So that's demand aggregation is the third point. And the fourth point about particularly attracting international investors into the Indian capital markets is about transparency and verification. So the importance of those final 2 bond principles, the annual reporting and the independent verification of those steps are crucial. So with that, I'll just hand it over back to Dr. Garg. Thank you.